Welcome, folks, to the People Prescription, your weekly dose of people ops wisdom. Today, I've got Danny Wareham, an organizational psychologist from his company. We're going to be primarily talking about culture today and how culture can be about workflow, not just posters on the wall. And we're also talking about the piece around culture not being just about the branding, but how we can look at implementing simple changes within your organization, such as booking leave, running meetings, and how you handle mistakes to really build a healthy culture for within your organization. And Danny, do you want to introduce yourself?
So, hey, Rich, thanks for having me. My name's Danny Wareham. I'm an organizational psychologist, and I believe that happy bees make tasty honey. If we have the right environment, the right leadership, the right culture, then performance is a side effect of that. And that's what I work with, is how do you create great cultures?
Absolutely. And, the culture is key within any organization. I mean, as you know, I'm a director of OES HR, a HR consultancy supporting businesses with their day-to-day operational people requirements. And culture is certainly something where if we're looking to get a second opinion on how to build a strong culture for an organization, Danny's the person we go to speak to understand really how organizations can build what would be effective teams and make sure that the teams understand how to address any bottlenecks when it comes to leadership, or making sure that ultimately you're getting the most out of the people teams and you're achieving the outcomes you're trying to achieve as a business. So really today is a conversational, working through some stories, sharing stories about areas that we've touched on in before. And one, I think, just as a starter for 10 really, is that I see quite a lot is really just around that kind of, they call it culture drift. And just to explain culture drift, I mean, in terms of the way I view culture drift, I know you might have a completely different view on this, which would be fabulous to sort of break down. It's really where, an organization's teams aren't necessarily working or pulling in the same direction as to the mission that they're on or the values that organization holds. And, that's usually documented somewhere around mission and values. But one thing I find a lot initially with these kind of questions from business leaders is that I always get a sense that vision, mission, and values is branding rather than actually something that will be utilized as a way to move people and ultimately engage people for years to come. I mean, what are your thoughts on that, Danny?
So, first of all, I do completely agree with the idea that it can feel like a branding exercise. I think a lot of people related things can, because they're naturally a little bit abstract and a little ambiguous, that we tend to think of them as a bolt on to the business. So we'll get the real business stuff done first. We'll get the conversion and the EBITDA and the earnings per share and the profit, and then we'll look at the culture and the behavior and the climate and so on.
Right.
So yeah, I completely agree that they're often seen as something separate, partly because of that ambiguous, abstract nature of them. For me, I think probably the worst phrase that's been used around culture is culture eats strategy for breakfast.
Right.
Because everybody knows it. And Peter Drucker never said it. Culture is strategy's counterpart. If you have strategy without culture, then you end up with a slog. You end up with everybody being dragged up the mountain in the pursuit of a deliverable, and there's no real concern about their experience of the journey, about their equipment, or about whether they'd want to climb another mountain. If you have culture without strategy, if you don't know where you're going, then you end up with a kind of commune. Everybody gets along, and it's a great place to work. But the world is strewn with businesses that have gone out of business that were great places to work that didn't actually achieve what they set out to be.
Right.
So for me, when you're designing culture and strategy, it's to be done at the same time, because if one fails, the other fails. Cultural drift is where we've set out originally with a mission of something to achieve. Our strategy is how are we going to achieve that? We should now start to think about what are the behaviors that are going to help that strategy be more successful. Where cultural drift happened is because strategies change, because goals change, etc. So if we stick to these hard and fast words on the wall, these values, then are they still encouraging and nudging the behaviors that we need that support that new direction? If they don't, culture is people, it's behaviors, it's going to outweigh, it's going to be more powerful and overwhelm that strategy, and you end up with that cultural drift.
I'm with you.
Yeah.
From a business leader's perspective, then, what kind of approaches have you seen that work well to really just kind of hit that reset button in terms of getting people back on track with, like you say, the mission, the values, the vision for the business?
The first one is don't look at culture first. A lot of times when we see underperformance or behaviors that we don't think are congruent with what our business does, we
Hmm.
tend to focus on what's the HR bit, what's the people bit, what's the soft squishy bit. Whilst those do need looking at, the first thing is, what are we here to achieve? Because if you don't know where you're going, what are you aligning the behaviors to? So step one for me is always, what's that kind of cliched North Star of what are we here to achieve? Where are we heading? And
Right.
then there is an intentionality around what behaviors and approaches are going to help us get closer to that. Most cultural change programs don't fail because of a lack of resource or a lack of intent. They fail because we're not quite sure where we're going. So we don't know what's blowing us off course because we don't know what our course is.
I'm with you. And I see that a huge amount, certainly within more modest size enterprises, perhaps companies engaging less than 100 employees.
Mhm.
And I understand why that's the case. A lot of the time it's because, the business leaders, they're spinning so many plates, they don't always have the opportunity to sit down and focus on these type of areas that we're touching on today. But I see it as almost an investment, really. It's something that if they invest early on in, that return on investment as far as productivity focus, as far as like the actual time in dealing with matters.
Yeah.
Once people understand the overall mission, the destination that they're on, overcoming challenges along the way become a hell of a lot more simple to deal with. And a lot of the time, operational tweaks, once you understand the overall destination that somebody's working towards, can have a huge impact on things like lifting morale. I mean, I can think of one
Yeah.
case recently that I dealt with where it was a situation. There was a manufacturing organization that had a team of around 12 people, which was that department, if you will, that particular area of the
Mhm.
business. The situation they had was that there was people on that team that were picking up regular additional work and weekend rotas essentially were covering it. And the same three people were always on call to do these weekends. And it was having a huge impact on the department's engagement, that particular team's engagement specifically. And they were getting upset, they were getting frustrated at the fact that it was the same three people coming up. And a really small tweak in this situation was, well, why don't we suggest that we put them on some kind of a rota that's moved around, that doesn't necessarily offer that sort of specific same three people approach. And we freed up, we removed the hidden cost of scheduling and handovers, because ultimately everybody was working on the same rota. And it was a really small operational tweak that actually lifted the morale. It rebalanced the weekend rotas so that the same three people weren't always on. And that helped massively actually re-engage the team in that particular area to start working on their ultimate mission, which was to make sure the customers had enough item and enough product, and which was the whole reason they were working on the weekends in the first place. So, sometimes when people hear the word culture, they're thinking about, slogans, they're thinking about posters on the wall. And it
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily need to be that, in my view. It can also be really sort of simple operational tweaks that businesses can make that actually lifts morale and gets people back on track. I mean, have you seen anything like that within
Uh,
your practice?
Almost every time. If we think of culture as being a strategic tool rather than a nice to have, and if we know where we're going, so you've identified what are the behaviors that are going to make that more likely, then actually things like the perceived inequity, the lack of fairness in that shift rotation,
Mhm.
if that is not articulated in a way that aligns with that North Star, people will make their own narratives, their own stories up. So within that group, you may have people that are always rotated that feel hard done by because I'm always rotated. But you
Mhm.
might also have people that are never rotated thinking they're getting favoritism in their treatment.
I'm with you.
Neither of those are necessarily true, but the truth doesn't really matter. We're subjective animals. So often, you said it's little things. I have a slogan that I live by when it comes to culture, which is make a big deal of the little things before those little things become a big deal. And the things that I've seen of all the straw that breaks the proverbial camel's back has always been the okay, it's just that one thing. I found out that the guy working on the production line next to me is on 20 pence an hour more than me. I
Right.
found out that I had a day's absence and I was taken to an investigation, and somebody else that had an absence didn't have that as well. And those may have been objectively the right decisions. The one absence might have been for a radiotherapy treatment or something.
Mhm.
But we don't live in this kind of nuance when it comes to this threat response that we have. We just see I'm being treated in a way that I perceive to be unfair, and therefore my behaviors are not going to be congruent with what we're trying to achieve as an organization. A bit of a meandering answer, but the little things are always the things that matter most. And what people tend to do when it comes to culture change is big initiatives. Let's move site, let's have an estate design, let's introduce a new remuneration package, let's have standing desks, let's have half a day for well-being and dogs in the office. And
Yeah.
all these things are fabulous in their own right, but do they encourage the behaviors that help you get closer to that North Star? And that's where to start. Where are we going?
And do you find that there are people that you speak to or organizations that you speak to that are more open to the risk of not having that in place as far as that mission? Have you noticed any patterns in the work that you do where it could be
Yeah,
sector specific, it could be
yeah,
the nature of how large that organization is that
yeah.
would create the additional risk?
There tends to be, in my experience, there tends to be sort of three types. There is the founder-founded company,
Mhm.
who almost all businesses are started through passion or trauma. So passion is that here's a side hustle I can monetize and I've always wanted to do this. Trauma is I can do my job better than my boss. I'll go and start myself, or I want a change in lifestyle. Or
Yeah.
either way, those are both incredible fuel sources to start a business.
Mhm.
And when you start a business, it becomes about what you do. What are
Right.
my services? What are the widgets I sell, etc. There comes a point in a founder's life where that fuel is expended. And now, because you haven't set the foundation of where are we heading, what are we about, what's our kind of mission and direction, and you often have hired in your own image as well. So you've got a couple of employees and you've almost created an environment where there's a bit of groupthink. Everybody kind of toes the line because Danny's the boss,
Right.
that you create an environment that's not able to flex and adjust to the change in market demands or deal with the fact that that fuel's been expended. That's the first one. The second one is long tenured organizations that have had strategic and cultural drift because we've been going for 40 years and I know how to dig a hole and nobody can tell me how to dig a hole, but the world around you has changed. So you're still working in the same ways that you've been doing in the past, and you're kind of wedded to this almost Stockholm syndrome of we know our processes and our protocols are not quite right, but they're ours and you're not touching us. And the third is very large businesses where there is a gap between the people that are making the decisions and where the reality of the culture is created, which is in the masses.
Mhm.
And there can be a disconnect between the two. So large blue chips, for example, struggle with this as well. And it becomes where you're too far away from the coalface to understand what the day-to-day reality is. So it's
Right.
very easy to say, let's have a value of X, but how does that manifest? You know, we're going to have a value of customer obsession. Everything we're doing is about the customer. Okay, well, how does that translate to Steve, who works in the IT department internally, or to Jane, who works in the accounts department and never speaks to an external customer? What's in it for me and how does it translate for me? So founder-led businesses that have started to stall because they
Mhm.
haven't got that identity, organizations that are long tenured, that have got ingrained habits and behaviors. And then the third is that disconnect, usually above 150 heads, that kind of Dunbar's number, as we talk about, that have got a disconnect between the lived experience and what they think the lived experience is.
Excellent. Going into a bit more detail on the lived experience. I mean, one of the things that I hear a lot in HR circles is around, oh, well, we've got to survey the team. We've got to make sure that we understand what the pain points are that they're experiencing and that surveys tell the full truth. And I find that can be sometimes a bit of a myth, really, in terms of, truth, surveys, theatre, what's real. But sometimes people gain pulses. It's nothing changes after the last one. There's that
Mm-hmm.
kind of some people see them, they can be quite skeptical around surveys and they think, okay, well, I'm going to submit something that's never going to be actioned. So the engagement can be
Yeah.
quite low on surveys initially. What would you say is an item that an organization, perhaps, if they're considering surveying the team, that they could then loop on publicly after a survey to get people back on? Is there an area that you find that happens a lot, that you see where somebody's been surveyed, and is there a pattern emerging perhaps on some that you've seen there where you can potentially sort of close that loop on publicly so people understand, okay, well, after a survey, things are being done? Or,
Yeah.
I think the hesitancy a lot of the time with business leaders when I speak to them about surveying the team, there's no guarantees that if suggestions are made that they will be implemented, either due to budgetary restraints, or it could even be leadership timing as well. Is there anything that, from what you've seen in your practice, that organizations can use as a prioritization matrix of, right, okay, let's put things first, and maybe offer some form of, it might be a modest value to begin with, that people understand then, okay, well, yeah, let's engage further with the survey approach?
Surveys can be incredibly powerful tools, but like you say, it's how they're used. And there are so many biases that we have naturally. There's over 170 cognitive biases that we have. So you have things like social desirability bias, which is where people answer questions in a way they think the person asking wants to hear it. So if you have a culture that encourages people to keep their head down, crack on and work, then actually you might get disingenuous answers unintentionally. So my approach with surveys is, first of all, do them frequently. Little and often is much better than one big survey during the year, because there's no way, first of all, from a data volume point of view, there's no way you can go through all of those comments, all of those answers, and come up with anything that you can execute quickly afterwards. Surveys are a KPI, they're a key performance indicator. They should tell you what you already know about your business, about your people. So actually, little and often, ask people how they're feeling, ask people what's making their job harder, and also look at the things that are getting in the way of that North Star. If you have team working and community and collaboration as values, then do you have things that encourage individualism? So what's your reward mechanics? Are they for individual performances? Even the language around your survey, if you put out the outputs as you said we did, that language is unintentionally othering and saying that the front line are different to the managers that are looking at the survey. So intentionally looking at, are you walking your talk, and doing it in a way that is consistent and smaller is the first one. And the second one is, and you alluded to it, do something with it. Now, you can't change the world, and nobody has ever changed the world off the back of a survey. But if there are things that come through the survey and your immediate thought is, why don't we just do that? Do it. Do it straight away. It's a perfect opportunity to give it to somebody that made the recommendation. That feeling of fairness and equity runs through those surveys as well. I'm not going to bother telling you what's wrong because it's so obvious the place is on fire. So actually, I'm going to disengage from the survey. You're then going to be able to use that lack of data as a way to not deal with the fire. Instead, go, we recognize there's a fire and we really need some help to put this fire out. What can you suggest? Okay, let's do it, because speed is of the essence. So little and often, not once a year, and do something with it, even if it's small little things, even if it's bringing other people on to be advocates for the change. Do things fast. And a quick example, I used to work for a blue chip, and it used to take them 3 months from opening the survey to closing the survey because they had like 12,000 employees. So by time they got the data, it then went through a cleansing process, and it was 5 months from start to finish. Now, culture is about the long-term behaviors of an organization. Climate is, how do you feel in the moment today? And you will have a kind of halo and horns effect, another bias, when people fill out the survey. If you've just done something on a Tuesday that annoys your people, you're going to see that reflected in the answers. If that's resolved on the Wednesday in a different cohort, fill it out on the Thursday, you're going to get a different result. So your data integrity and credibility is different, and the length of time's far too long. And by the time you've done something with the data, the next survey's due. Do it fast.
Yeah, so like you say, consistency is key with these kind of things. And I find a lot of my time spent saying to business leaders, it's okay to repeat yourself. It's quite usual. It's quite normal for a business leader to, as a CEO, 40% of your time is repeating yourself.
I only tell my partner I love her once a year. It's ridiculous. And the way she knows I love her is not because I said I love her. It's the daily micro quite mundane things like making sure she's got the right sweetener in her coffee.
Mhm.
It's the little consistent, authentic things that say that I care and I notice you and I appreciate you. It's not a once a year activity.
And again, I find there's some confusion really around that from business leaders about, okay, well, what does good look like? It doesn't necessarily, in my view, have to be like a verbal confirmation or a well done. It could be something written, like a really small thank you note about something specific that you're trying to drive as a behavior within the organization, as a sort of mindset within the
Yeah.
organization. Thank you notes. One of the business leaders I've spoke to in the past does this thing where he'll go around different rooms and doodle things that are related to the values. It's just very quick, but people see that and they think, oh, he's kind of living and breathing the values that they're trying to build within that particular business. And that was a very sales oriented business, but at the same time, it worked massively because the people within those teams, they viewed the leader as actually, you know what, they're practicing what they're preaching here. It's not just the same, well, we want you to show up in this way. They were showing up in that way every day, so that helped massively to get buy-in from the teams to follow that vision that he had. Another area, I'd say, again, a bit of myth busting really that we're doing here now, but a lot of the times I speak to business leaders and immediately they think if we say culture, they get concerned about perks driving engagement. And I find a lot of the time that actually looking at processes and removing friction within workflows can actually be a huge cultural driver as well for the team. People refer to it as like Pizza Fridays, and it's like, okay, well, if we're doing this, then the team must be happy. I find a lot of the time that what can sometimes really drive engagement down is needless workflows or things that just don't need doing. So one of the first questions I ask when we're looking at, okay, well, processes and how can we increase productivity within a team is, what was the last piece of needless admin that you killed? That can be a huge indicator. It can have a big impact on culture generally because people then understand, actually, you know what, the business is trying to set us up for the win here. I mean, have you got any areas of where you've seen that happen, perhaps where there is a misconception that perks drive the engagement, where actually something else could drive engagement more effectively?
There's so much to this question. So first of all, in the defense of pizzas, I do love a pizza. There's nothing wrong with Pizza Fridays. But if you're using Pizza Fridays as one of the main ways of driving behavior, unless that behavior is getting people fatter, it's not going to be sustainable. You have a process in your head. Keep in mind, our brains evolved 200,000 years ago on the savannah. There were no pizzas around then. There were no perks, incentives, and so on. But our brains are still wired in that way. And one of the things that we have in our heads is part of our system of homeostasis that keeps us at a certain level. So it keeps our heart rate at a certain level, our temperature at a certain level, but it also keeps our level of contentment and happiness at a certain level. And this process is called hedonic adaptation. It's designed so that if you suffer a trauma in your life, if somebody passes away, for example, your base level of happiness drops and your brain works hard to get it back up as close as possible to that level of contentment. If something good happens, you have a spike and it works hard to bring it back down because being super happy all the time might get you eaten by a leopard. So what perks do, if you give somebody a pay rise or a bonus or a single pat on the back or a pizza or anything, you get a little spike in performance. If you think of when you bought your first car, on the day you got it, you got that little spike in happiness. You will have driven it 100 miles, shown it off to all your friends and so on. A week later, it's just a car. Okay. On the day you get your bonus, your pay rise, or you get a new job, you get that little spike in happiness and you're super content. Have you ever known anybody cartwheel away from the cash machine on payday? Because our brains have worked to get us back to that base level of contentment. So it's not that perks are bad. Perks can drive short-term little spikes in contentment, but they're not sustainable. Sustainability in culture is all about trust, and trust is a biological response that we have when other people have our well-being at heart. Can I sleep by the campfire knowing you've got my back and watching out for those leopards? And in the modern world, what this means is, do you see me? Do you recognize me? Do you know the difference I make? And are you trying to make my life less hard? So in that sense, smoothing out processes and policies making sure you understand that I have other things going on in my life that might impinge on work or not. So can I have flexible working and work late on a Thursday and come in later on a Friday? These sort of things are not about the practicality and pragmatism of running a business. They're about demonstrating that trust to people so that you can say, I've got your back and I see you. And just to bring it back to a point you made a moment ago, that's also the difference between praise and recognition. A lot of companies praise. Praise is, Rich is a great guy who always goes the extra mile and his customers are so glad to have him. I wish I could clone him. The thing is, I can change the word Rich to Steve, Sarah, Jennifer. It's generic, it's cookie cutter. And a lot of our reward and recognition processes are like this. A salary is one of those things. Cards are often like that, vouchers, etc. Pizzas for everybody on a Friday. So they don't recognize you as an individual and your individual contribution because you can literally swap the name out. Recognition is different. Recognition is emotive and specific. So it's, thank you, Rich, for doing that particular project. That meant that freed up my time so I could go and concentrate on this, and I really appreciate it. Thank you. You can't change anybody's name. So to bring it full circle, removing or smoothing over those kind of processes and bumps in the road to show that I care about that finite amount of energy that you've got is one way of showing I trust. It's one way of building culture. And another way is recognizing the individual, for better or worse, shows that I recognize the difference you specifically made in this specific scenario.
Absolutely. And it speaks on a lot around psychological safety as well. I mean, what I was hearing there as you were explaining it is that ultimately truth is a currency in business, and building that safe place for people to have conversations that build trust and ultimately conveying that message that, look, we've got you back. That's incredibly useful in businesses ultimately that are innovating, that are actually, they're going into territory that's brand new. There's going to be some feedback as part of that. There's going to be development areas where people have perhaps tripped up and, they've met a hurdle and they've had to reset and learn from it and build it better next time. So again, a lot of what we're speaking on here, these are sort of universal laws, if you will, things that people can take and apply within any type of business. And simple things, I always suggest it helps to create simple processes so you ultimately build up that repetition and the consistencies that's needed. Complexity can really kill consistency, so from that side, looking at options around flexible working, that we talk about, okay, well, is that a perk? And I think, ultimately, flexible working can enhance culture. But the truth is, it's more about the fairness and the predictability that you bring into either an individual team member or colleagues as a team that actually matter a lot more than the theory of flexibility itself. Is that something that you see within your practice?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And psychological safety is, you kind of hit the nail on the head, that psychological safety is not something that you give people. I always use the examples of things like, you're not funny. You're not good looking. Okay. That's not because you're not funny or good looking. I decide that because it's relational. Right. And psychological safety is the same. We can do all the things that say that it's safe. So I've got an open door policy and here's a suggestions box for saying what's wrong with the place. But ultimately, every individual determines whether somewhere is safe or not. All we can do as leaders and as business owners is to increase the likelihood of that happening by providing certainty. Do we walk our talk? If we say we're about X, do we do X? I've got a book coming up soon. I talk about Elon Musk. Elon Musk walks his talk. He says if you work at Twitter, you're going to be working 70 hours a week. You're going to be berated. You're going to be sleeping in the office. Now, people will look at that and say that's a toxic culture. I don't, because there are people queuing up around the block to work at Twitter. There is a separate argument of whether it's the right culture, because I would argue Twitter's an innovative company, so the behaviors that you created actually stifle innovation. But the reality is, he says that this is what it's like working at Twitter, and it's exactly like that. How many companies say that they're like Richard Branson, we're family and we all get on here, but then the reality is very different. And where there's an incongruence between what you say and what you do, that's where toxicity can come in. And that's detrimental to your psychological safety. There are lots of studies about the benefits of things like employee engagement and purposeful cultures in terms of the fiscal benefits. So 2.5 times more productivity, double the profitability, 62% fewer accidents. But actually, there's a lot of studies that show the societal benefits. Purposefully engaged employees that feel that the work they do matters and they're seen in their workplace are more likely to put their bins out for the neighbour, to
I'm
mow
with
their neighbour's lawn, to donate time in their communities to charity. There is also the converse is true. People that are disengaged at work are more likely, there's a correlation between that and debt, breakdowns of families, and domestic violence. So my argument would be we rent employees from their family, and we have a duty to return them in a better condition. And that's, yes, it is great that the honey comes with it, that we have more fiscal performance. But the bottom line is when we do not create these environments, it spills over into kitchens and communities and classrooms.
Yeah, absolutely. And, from a lot of the companies that I speak to are more modest size enterprises. So, less than 250 employees, 100 employees or modest SMEs. If business leaders are thinking, okay, well, I'm trying to read between the lines here around how do we build that kind of fairness and predictability that allows employees to go back to the family in a good state, in a healthy state. It could be something really simple, like looking at your annual leave management and figuring out, okay, well, how can we build in a bit more rigor and consistency about who gets time off and when, how you allocate leave for prime leave weeks, such as over the
Yep.
summer holidays when people are off school and they want to spend time with the families, and how transparent can we be when offering those shifts to people. It doesn't have to be something super complicated. It could be
No.
something quite simple like that actually drives the right kind of culture within your organization that can sometimes be the difference between being more profitable or less profitable. And building up those really sort of small changes over time compounds into massive differences and ultimately keeps people for a lot longer. People stay in environments like that. We're kind of going through a bit of myth busting as well as the conversation, which is interesting. But I mean, a lot of the time, I think when you speak to more modest size enterprises, they see this, okay, well, are we just creating like a visual poster and just
Yeah.
add on the wall? And is that all we need to do? Or is it more than that? And I think that it is a hell of a lot more than that, in my opinion. It's about keeping people accountable for the kind of behaviors that you're trying to build up within that business. It's about understanding, okay, well, yeah, it's great to have the values on the wall, but how do you enforce those values? And how are they brought into the decision-making process for that business? And for me, a lot of the time, the work I spend on that is around setting clear objectives for teams and people and making sure that, okay, they're recognized for achieving those objectives. And it's not like a set once and forget about it. You're constantly checking in. We hear in HR circles all the time about the power of a well-timed one-to-one. But I'd go further than that and say, well, actually, if we're going to communicate with our teams, they need to be, not an annual appraisal sit down. I think, in my opinion, the annual appraisal's dead now. That's the sort of 1970s, 1980s. We're building widgets. We need to be a lot more focused on regular communication and sitting down with people, whether it be quarterly, monthly, weekly, depending on the nature of the role, and really trying to drive those behaviors and link them to specific outcomes and objectives for that person's role. That's ultimately how, over time, in my view, you would build the right values within the team, because they're constantly being assessed and kept accountable for the work that they do. But accountability works both ways. They're keeping the business accountable as well for those areas, which we've offered a very quick snippet solution of, okay, well, look at your leave management policies and make sure it's transparent and fair. But if you're thinking, okay, well, what's the opposite side of that into what would need a bit more consistency in showing up, then look at the standards that you're holding your teams to. Have you got standards in place? Do they know what their objectives are?
And why do you have the standards?
Yeah, exactly.
Are we still doing things with the best of intentions because we've always done it? And I have another rule that if somebody breaks a rule, you've got a people problem. But if lots of people break a rule, you've got a rule problem. And it can be a really good indicator in your business that something that you say the business is about and those values that need to be lived and not laminated is the phrase I use. If you have behaviors that are happening in your business, it's often easier to focus on the behavior rather than what's causing that behavior, what's normalizing it. For example, if you have a dodgy salesperson,
Right.
you will have HR policies that investigate and take to disciplinary, etc. You'll have BI, management information, to remove commission payments from that person. But the thing is, if that situation gets to a point where the person is dismissed and you employ a new person, if you haven't dealt with what's encouraging those behaviors, then you end up with another dodgy salesperson. And I see this a lot in recruitment, that Dave has left our business. So we've got a Dave-shaped hole. So let's take Dave's job description and create a job advert and recruit for someone who's like Dave. We then get Dave into our business, and Dave too was sold on a dream of this is what we're like on our best ever day ever. We've won all these awards, we're an amazing place to work and so on. But Dave gets in there and he now knows what the reality is on a cold, wet Tuesday night in Stoke.
Yes.
And Dave decides this isn't for me. I was missold a dream. So what happens is Dave too gets slated. We've hired an idiot. Or the recruitment agency gets slated. They didn't go through rather than maybe the environment they're coming into, the behaviors, the protocols, the processes, maybe those we're kind of unintentionally lying to ourselves about what it's really like to work here and why we're here to deliver. So your workplace is a soup. Now, are you a lovely, delicious soup, and are you a big, fat, tasty carrot, or are you a cockroach?
Yeah, exactly. If that was framed in a way to business leaders, they might initially think, oh, it's a bit prickly, they're not sure 100%. It puts them in a position where they've got to ask really tough questions of the business themselves in terms of how far they want to go with it. Ultimately, I find with that, though, it's quite useful to understand that it's coming from a positive place. Asking those questions is from a position of improvement and understanding, not necessarily judgment. It's just, okay, well, what more can we do to ultimately quell things like, sometimes sniping and blame can come up a lot in HR meetings around such and such.
So that sniping is a behavior. So what has made the people that are sniping feel that that is an acceptable behavior? And what organizational psychologists will do is we'll look and go, well, actually, the reason is that there is an appearance of a lack of control from elsewhere in the business. We're not sure if our jobs are safe, if the market's changing, if we're landing this new client, but there's some ambiguity around our certainty as a business. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to maximize the control of what I have. So I'm going to become a gatekeeper of information. Everything needs to go through me for signing off in triplicate. And that becomes office politics and sniping. But the person then gets blamed for being the assassin. But really, it's just a threat response to what's going on in the wider environment. And what IOs will do, in industrial organizational psychologists will do, is we'll come in and look at the rest of the organization and say, what you do has got you this far. There's loads of good stuff in here. We don't want to throw the baby out with bathwater. But what is encouraging these behaviors that make your business goals less likely to be achieved? And at the moment, you're focusing on the sniping. The sniping's not the issue. That's the symptom. What really is the issue is you don't have documented processes. Your recruitment processes might not be quite. Your reward and recognition is encouraging the wrong behaviors. So let's change these little things over here and then see what happens further upstream.
Absolutely. And I can think of a few little things as an example that companies could use. I mean, you're thinking it could be a really tight handover. If you're a manufacturing company, you're operating 24/7. It might be, the first 5 minutes of a shift, setting the tone as a handover for a late shift moving into the morning shift. Or, it could be a checklist just to go over, look, this is the single source of truth in terms of what is required today. And that can also reduce the sniping and the blame. And,
Can I ask you a question? How many times have you had a client who says, Steve's on his training, and they go, right, here's the training, we'll go through the manual, we'll go through everything. Right, now here's how it really works.
Yeah.
So that is an indication that there's something, when you've got these informalities of how things really get done around here, then there is an incongruence between what you say you're about and what your processes and protocols and employee handbooks and so on are doing.
100%. And from an attrition point of view, from a people perspective, if I'm dealing with a company that's got perhaps a very high level of attrition, people are leaving, then immediately those things, they're the kind of things that we're going to get into conversations about in terms of, okay, well, you're saying one thing, but actually in reality, this is happening. How would a new person to the business perceive that? Is that perhaps an area of certainty for them? Humans love certainty. They love predictability.
Yes.
And generally that doesn't sit well for attrition. So where there are those contrasts going on, it's like, well, okay, what's driving that? And I think if you start asking, I'm a big believer in the 5 whys. You ask yourself why 5 times, and eventually you'll get to the real issue. You can use that as a way in which to find those bottlenecks, which broadly over time will drive profitability and increase your productivity too. So the simple examples of like meeting debt, for example, when was the last time you sat in a meeting and you're thinking, look, this is a bit bloated, we're repeating things that we've gone over before, do we actually need to be in this meeting? That can, just doing a quick review of, okay, well, are there any reoccurring meetings that we can cancel and just start again?
Why is your meeting determined by the Outlook window?
Yeah.
Our meetings are always half an hour, 1 hour. Why aren't they ever 42 minutes, 12 minutes? Why do they always start at 9 o'clock or at 9:30? So often the tools and frameworks we have around ourselves that are just how we do things normalize the behaviors that we have. And sometimes it's good to have outside eyes, whether it's a HR consultant or psychologist, because the metaphor I use is that a fish doesn't know it lives in water because it's just how it is here. But the people standing on the edge of the pond can see the things that are working well and not quite working well. And it's the people on the outside of the pond are either trained to look, or they're people like your new starters and your leavers. And if you think of a typical new starter experience, you have the recruitment process, which tends to sell only the good things about a business.
Right.
They walk into the door and the very first day they go, congratulations on joining us. Here's your employee handbook that tells you all the ways we can sack you.
Right.
You then go into the operation, they go, well, some of the things aren't quite ready yet. Your access control isn't ready, or your laptop hasn't been done by IT, etc. So all these little pieces of evidence, none of which are bad in their own right, but they all compound to go, hang on, what you said and what it's really like is slightly different.
Right.
How much more different could it be if I have a client who, when they interview people, they record what they drank in the interview.
Right.
When somebody is successful for a job, their new manager will meet them in reception. So they're not having to meet a random receptionist to then sit around and wait. They will meet them in reception with their vanilla latte and say, it's lovely to see you again. And it's those little micro things that go, I see you, I recognize you. And it buys you that social currency, that social capital, so that because IT haven't got your laptop ready, it's not as big of an impact because I see you. Now, those cost nothing. They can be systemized. They can be written into your onboarding process, and they literally cost nothing and add a huge amount of value.
Absolutely.
And what Externalize can do is spot these opportunities for these highly emotive touch points in your employee experience so that they can improve all aspects of your processes, from payroll to onboarding, offboarding, day-to-day, everything. And that's why it's useful to have people like you, Rich.
Absolutely. And yourself too, Danny. I think, a lot of business leaders think that when they're bringing somebody in to support with culture, that it's a long drawn out process. And to a certain extent, there's aspects that you will need to go deeper on. But, I always take the view with things like this, speed beats perfection every day of the week, So if you can find sort of small wins that will allow the business to sort of build that curiosity and ultimately get employee relations in a really positive place, then, like you say, remembering somebody's order, what the drink is, what the favorite film is, or anything like that, it can have a huge impact on engagement for businesses. What do you find that as well from dealing with conflicts in the workplace, especially? I mean, this is something that pops up regularly within HR. You're constantly looking at ways in which to avoid perhaps grievances. Occasionally, you might be reacting to a grievance. And I mean, my view on this is that actually there are things that businesses can do which avoid small conflicts turning into what would be quite hardened grievances. And a lot of the time, it's about raising the thing that's bugged the person early on, approaching it within a couple of days perhaps, and trying to just sort of connect in terms of, okay, well, how can we resolve this so people understand what's caused the conflict in the first place. There's a lot of unresolved small conflicts within organizations that can sometimes just be sort of brushed over. Do you find that in your practice as well, that there are things that organizations can do to avoid those unresolved small conflicts brewing and festering into becoming hardened grievances?
I'm really smiling because make a big deal of the little things before the
Yeah.
little things become a big deal. And that
Right.
applies also to these little niggles that go unresolved because they're just little. You're overreacting. And then out of nowhere, something else that's equally little means that that employee then just blows up over nothing. And it's not over nothing, it's over these multiple things that have kind of niggled away. And depending on our personalities as well, if we're high in agreeableness, then you tend to smooth over the troubles in the tribe. But then
Right.
eventually there is a you're dead to me, enough's enough. So these things can look completely out of character, these behaviors that blow up as well. I'm not anti grievance. I think
Right.
grievances are a really powerful tool because they're a data point to say I'm unhappy with something that's going on in the organization or something that's affecting me. So if they're used correctly, rather than as a start of what can be a combative process of binaryizing who's right and who's wrong, we don't live in black and white. It's a colorful world. So how do we have conversations that look at all of those colors and use grievances as just another data point?
Right.
So, but again, the grievance and the behaviors are the result of something that has made those behaviors acceptable. What's encouraging that? And a good place to start, I know you know David Rock's scarf model is a really good place to start. So is there something that's threatening my status? Status includes things like competency. So if you're
Mhm.
bringing in a tool, maybe it's an AI tool that helps people do their job. Well, actually, if some people feel a threat to their status, then they're not going to adopt that tool because I know how to do my job. And actually, you taking part of my job away, framed under you making my job easier, is a threat to me.
Right.
Certainty, we've talked about a lot. Do I know what's going on? Autonomy, do I have control over what I'm doing? So actually having a you need to make X widgets per hour KPI, well, I don't have any flexibility in that. So it might be as a team, you need to do X widgets as a team, and then you devolve power to the team manager. So they've got some flexibility within, so there's certainty within guardrails. A lot of return to office mandates are failing, not because they're not the right thing to do, but because people feel they're having their autonomy taken away. You know, I
Right.
can't drink my own coffee or go to my own bathroom or work with my cat on my lap. So
Yeah.
one of the ways to give autonomy back might be that you can set your workstation up in a certain way, or you can choose the 2 days a week that you're in the office, etc. Relatedness is the fourth one. Do I feel safe? And this is the biggest one in grievances. Often grievances, they're a form of offense wrapped up as defense. They're a
Yeah.
way of I'm going to get the first punch in, but I'm going to weaponize the company's policies
Mhm.
against it. Well, actually, it's a behavior. So what's normalized that? And it could be there are other threats to I'm not safe because I saw that you just laid off X, Y, and Z over there.
Yeah.
Or I've seen that there's a load of AI jobs in call centers. Me and Klarna have just laid off 700 people. I work in a contact center in a different industry. I now feel unsafe. So addressing that through communications and so on. And the last
Just
one is
on
fairness, which we've touched on as well.
yeah,
Fairness and equity.
Salesforce, I mean, it was announced last week. I mean, today's the 9th of September, and they've announced 4,000 cuts due to the adoption of,
Yeah.
technologies and repetition. So what you're speaking on now actually is incredibly relevant for the
Lloyd's
time.
Bank have just done it. Lloyd's Bank have just done it, and it ties a few of them together. So if you lose your income for a while,
Mhm.
then your family will recognize that because you've done all you've done in the past and you've had their back and you've been there for you, that actually it's okay to live on bread and water for a couple of weeks because everything's going to be okay. We'll all huddle together and help each other. Lloyd's Bank have just announced that they're using Rank and Yank, which is the old Jack Welch 1980s. Let's force distribute and dismiss the bottom 5%.
Right.
Now, if they were in trouble financially, that might be a rational decision. But what's happened is they've posted record profits. They've just announced a 15% share increase on their dividends for their half year results, and they've still used this as a way to generate even more profit. So now you've threatened people's certainty, their
Right.
status, and their relatedness. And because you're letting people go or threatening people to leave when you're at a time of good, when you're doing well fiscally, actually that fairness is being triggered as well. And that's why you're starting to see so much bad press and bad feeling towards Lloyd's Banking Group is because of all those different threat responses that are happening.
I'm with you. I'm with you. So you continue then. So we're talking about scarf model. We're talking about how we can enhance people's autonomy to get them on the right level, on the same level of communication and engaged in what they're doing without meeting those sort of frictions.
So the last one we kind of touched on is fairness, equity. Do I perceive that I'm being treated with equity. And it's not about whether the employer thinks they're being equitable, because
Right.
everybody gets the same pay rise, everybody gets the same shifts, everybody has to work the same number of Saturdays. What's the perception? Well, the perception is he works all the Saturdays. And as we said earlier, that person that's working all the Saturdays might feel hard done by, but
Right.
to me, my perception is that's favoritism.
I'm
So
with
a lot of these can be mitigated by being close to your people, by asking them, what's working well, what would be better? Do you know why we're here? What's that North Star we're trying to achieve? Okay, well, what's making that trip harder?
Yeah, you've got a shared goal, a shared interest there, and you build it together. One thing I find interesting, I mean, you and I both get involved in like psychometrics and communication and linking into this and ways for organizations to, okay, well, how can we perhaps adopt a slightly different way dealing with people? I find psychometrics is a really good introduction for leaders, for other people teams to try and understand themselves more so they can then, convey these things that we're talking about today in a way that lands with each person, because each person is going to be slightly different in terms of, you might find somebody that they like that written agenda memo at the beginning of the week saying, right, this is what we're doing. Others, they just want it to be, brought up in a well-timed one-to-one or as part of a handover session.
Yeah.
So I find that the way in which organizations, the channels that they use to communicate this, how often they're doing it as well, has a big impact on how effective the overall strategy is in achieving the outcomes. I mean, from a team communications perspective, what would you recommend that organizations can do when it comes to sort of building good dynamics and good communication within the business?
So I'm chuckling because I'm a psychologist, which means the answer to every question is it depends.
Right. Yeah.
Let's think of it another way. Imagine you're buying a car, and as you know, cars are regulated. There has to be for 5 specific safety points. You might have a finance agreement. You need a license to drive the car. There's tests involved, etc. Imagine if you were going to buy a car and the company said, we only accept cash. Okay. And there's no receipt. What would you think? Would you think that is a safe company to do business with?
Not at all.
Now, objectively, it might be. They might be the best cars. They might have thousands of Trustpilot reviews that say they're fantastic. So objectively, it's fine. But subjectively, we feel there's something fishy here. When it comes to communicating across an organization, how you communicate and when you communicate is just as important as what you communicate.
Right.
And often people that I'm quite happy just tell me I've got a really good memory. But if I'm feeling unsafe, I want that receipt. I want stick it on an email to me. This is one of the things that I look for in organizations is if I go to the front line and have a look at their Outlook, their email clients, and they've got 3,000 read messages still in their inbox, then I know that email is not a communication tool. Email is a library of covering my backside tool.
Right.
Okay. So there isn't a right or wrong answer. It depends. But the things that we don't say, we're wired to spot these incongruences and see whether we're safe and whether we've got certainty. So whatever you're doing, do it consistently is one way to kind of mitigate that variability. If you think that people will feel more comfortable having it in writing, there is nothing stopping you from using multiple media. So for example, I've seen somebody do a commission update. I can't think of the framework update. Now, if you play through what is the purpose of the communication, the first is you need version control because you don't want different sets of metrics going out there. So you want one version of the truth. So it might be the actual mechanics are stored on a SharePoint, for example. So you've got version control as an editor, everybody's got access to it. But you might need a second message to go, here's the nuts and bolts of how it works. This is your accelerators and your clawbacks and terms and conditions. You might need that. But you also need a softer, maybe in person, this is what's changed since last month. And this is why it's changed. So I know your conversion target's gone up, but it's gone up because we've got marketing, we've got an advertising campaign that's going out on the 3rd, which we expect to drive up, blah, blah, blah. So now you're taking away that lack of certainty and you're delivering the message in the best medium for that particular message's purpose. So to bring it all the way back, the same as they started with culture, intentionality. What is it you're trying to achieve? And then what's the right tools and behaviors and approaches that help that get closer? And comms, don't treat it like a fire and forget. We'll just carpet bomb everybody with the same email. And if they don't read it, it's their problem. That's not comms. That's broadcasting.
I think for our listeners, one thing that would be incredibly useful at this stage would be understand, okay, well, if we wanted to start a plan to tune up culture from next
Mhm.
week, and say we want to start it next Monday, I mean, as a starter for 10, I'd be saying, look at perhaps doing a bit of a friction review of, walk the floor a bit, speak to your people, sit in on a handover if you do handovers, or listen to a customer call, or attend a team meeting, and ask a few questions. Where are you waiting in this process? Is there anything that you need to rework more than once? Because immediately I'm thinking that's a potential automation that could be used.
Yeah.
But or even asking a question: if we could kill one piece of admin by next Friday, what would it be? And that can help massively just to get people thinking a bit more about, okay, well, how can we create that right environment for the people teams? How can we make sure that they're feeling like they're being listened to, and that engagement rises straight away? But if we were thinking at it from the perspective, okay, well, we'll do that for week one, really simple start off. What would you consider for week two? What would be something an organization could implement fairly quickly to enhance their picture when it comes to, the culture?
So I would go back a step. So before week one, where you're doing your fact find, I would start with, what are you trying to achieve? That North Star is your starting point. You can't determine whether the wind is on your sails pushing you towards a goal if you don't know what the goal is first.
Right.
And that can help remove or allow us to challenge some of our biases as we're doing our walkarounds and so on, that we're not just having affirmation and confirmation bias echoing back the things that we think are good. We talked about agreeableness earlier. I've heard a conversation in financial institutions where people that are low in agreeableness, which is more outcome focused and so on, are having conversations like, do you think I was too hard on them? No. If they think it's hard now, they should see how hard we had it when we were coming up. Okay.
Right.
So your personality, your individual differences can make you blind to certain things. A fish doesn't know it lives in water. So first is, where are you going? Second is, by all means, do that fact find. If you can have external eyes or something that can give you a bit more objectivity, you can use, there are certain frameworks and tick boxes that you can go through to look for certain pieces of evidence. The third is, when it comes to change, nobody likes change being done to them.
Right.
It is a myth that people don't like change. People don't mind change if they feel that they're in control of the change. If I say to you, Rich, you should start going to the gym, it's going to extend your life, you lose a few, you go, bugger off. I'm not going to do that. But if you decide to go to the gym, then you might rope me into it as an accountability partner. We both go at the same time.
Right.
So how can you give control and autonomy over to the people that are most affected by these things that they've pointed out are requiring some kind of amendment? And you can't change everything. It might be that piece of admin that you hate doing. We have to do it because there's a regulatory requirement, or it has a knock-on effect in another area of the business that you don't see. So actually, how do we help you understand the difference you make? It might be, let's do a one-day job swap and see how other places in the business work. But the bottom line is, how do you bring people on the journey, or ideally make it more of their journey, so that they can go and be advocates for any change, etc. And if it can't change, they become advocates for your message that it can't change, and what else can we go after?
I mean, immediately as you're sharing that there, I'm thinking, Simon Sinek, start with the why. It is trying to make sure people understand first and foremost, before you even frame a change, okay, how come we're in this position? What is the reason driving it? And a lot of the time, when people understand the reasons, go around challenges, they'll climb mountains, because, they've got that really strong logic and reasoning behind what they're doing in the first place.
It's the connection to what I do matters. And everybody, whether they recognize it consciously or say it out loud, everybody wants to feel that they make a difference, that they matter. Well, how can if I just drive a taxi A to B? I have a friend, Abs Chowdhury, who runs Capability, and they specialize in mobility transport for getting people from A to B. But that's not what they do. What they do is dignity. It's hard to get behind, I get a taxi from this place to this place, but it's much easier to get behind, how do we provide dignity to a population? And that then manifests in the behaviors they have in their business. So we never touch somebody's wheelchair, because that's not their wheelchair. That's part of them. That's part of their body. So we're very careful in how we ask permission for certain things, etc. In your organization, we know what we do.
Right.
Why do we do? What do we really sell? What difference do we really make? And then make that the golden thread all the way through your organization.
Absolutely. I mean, like you say in that example there of mobility and transport, ultimately, it isn't only about the literal of what do you do. It's
Yeah.
all the fringe benefits of being able to share that you're looking after somebody, or that you're giving somebody empowerment to get to an event, or that you're keeping them healthy if you're taking them
Yeah.
to a hospital appointment.
For our clients, everywhere else they go, they tend to be invisible.
Mhm.
Nobody looks at them, they dehumanize them, they other them.
Right.
Whereas when you're traveling with capability, and this does sound like an advert for capability, I'm conscious, but when you're traveling with them, you're not Steve, the disabled person. That label doesn't matter. I'm Steve and I'm treated with the dignity of any other human.
Mm.
And it feels very easy to kind of connect to that. It might feel difficult if you just print paper stuff or work the door at Valentino's. I'm showing my age there. But that is what you do. It's not the difference it makes to your customers and your clients' lives. And if you can work out what that is your North Star.
Absolutely. I mean, certainly for OESHR, it's about creating a best place to work. It's about, we spend a hell of a lot of time at work. So it's really key, in my opinion, to make sure that we do set workers up for the win and that they enjoy the time spent at work. And with that, there's so many other benefits that you could say, when it comes to pounds and pence. It's an investment, really. You're
Yes.
creating future wealth for yourself by creating those environments. That's ultimately why we do what we do. It's creating those best places to work. For every organisation, what would be Fergun's?
To create places where people can purposely contribute without fear of ridicule or reprimand. That's not Fergun. That's, if I host a barbecue, it's not about how great my food is. It's, is the temperature okay? Is the food okay? Is the wine okay? It's about how do I set you up to be at your best? My North Star is congruent throughout my life. It just manifests in the work I do at Fergun by helping you to create places where people can purposely contribute.
100%. So yeah, I'd encourage all our listeners as well that if they find that what we're talking about today resonates or to connect with us, we're going to share contact details on the back of today. The links will be below. But have a think about, take stock about, okay, well, why is it you do what you do? Okay, you're a family-run business, you're third generation. How come the business was started at the beginning? We deal with a lot of family-run businesses that can sometimes struggle because of technology advancements. The mission that they're on's changed slightly,
The
perhaps.
shadow of the former owner, because
Yeah,
our legacies affect us too. Yeah, absolutely.
100%. So use some of these methods that we've shared today to try and get under the hood of the business and really figure out, okay, well, what can we adjust to sink it into our reasons for being now and why we do what we do. I'd also say, if we're thinking, okay, well, what can we do as a culture plan? Maybe consider, we spoke about surveys, but once we've gone through those processes of figuring out the why, doing a bit of a review of, okay, well, what are the barriers? At the end of that process, review it with your team, whether that be informally in a one-to-one or do a survey, try and figure out the gripes so you can then announce, okay, well, how have we fixed it? When the date is that it's going to start, when will it land? All of that around, okay, well, how do we measure this? One of the big pushes that we get back on when we're talking about culture is that, okay, well, we can't measure it. So if we can't measure it, we can't really lead on it. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Is that something you hear occasionally?
You can't measure if you're a good husband. If your kids are not performing at school, you don't sit them down in front of a PowerPoint presentation and talk through all their objectives for the next year.
Yeah,
So we have to accept that work is a bit of a false environment. We're not designed for work. So a lot of our frameworks that we impose on ourselves can feel restrictive and mechanical and so on as well. So I like surveys because they give you another data point into your organization. There is a question whether the data is accurate or unbiased, etc. But in an ideal world, you wouldn't need surveys because the things that people are saying they're happy with or unhappy with, you should be able to discuss, particularly if you're a small business.
right.
So it comes back to that psychological safety. The place that I would start is, where are you heading? Have a look what you've got now. Have a look at yourself. There is a reason that every leadership book ever published has a section on self-awareness. So where are you going? What do you have today? What's helping and hindering? What do you have in yourself? Because we all have blind spots, but they're completely rational to us. How do you make the journey other people's? How do you show your workings and bring people on this journey? And where you can, let them take ownership for those parts as well. But it all starts with know why you're here, and know what your strengths and your blind spots are.
Absolutely. And I think, sort of bringing it home in terms of, okay, if you're a business leader listening to this podcast today and you're concerning yourself with, okay, well, can you give us an illustration? I can think of one, certainly in the last 12 months for OES HR, where we've supported a manufacturing business and we've saved them roughly around £70,000 in a year of people mistakes and headaches. They've got 30% fewer employee issues because we're tracking that. We are measuring it.
Yep.
And there's been a huge lift in satisfaction by implementing what would be quite simple processes of how they process changes around setting clear standards for work that's been done. It's not only about the wallpaper that we were talking about earlier,
Yeah.
on the wall. It's, the proofs in the workflow. And as you were saying earlier, be aware of that sugar high of, okay, well, if you're going to implement a fun day out, how long is that going to last compared to if the rotors and the handovers are remaining really messy? That can crash morale even further. So what can you be doing as an organization that have those lasting, consistent effects, positive effects? What about for yourself? Have you had a quick win in the last 12 months you could share with us?
I love that sugar high analogy. That is absolutely what it is. But a very quick one. So culture change is basically free. If you know what you're looking for, then actually there is a terrible cliche with consultants that we will read the time off your watch and then charge you for it.
Right.
Unfortunately, a lot of the work that I do is exactly that, because a fish doesn't know it lives in water. So I'll come in and say, have you noticed this is working and that's getting in your way and you do this? The clients always go, yeah, actually, you're right. Now you've pointed it out. And it's really easy to fix. So a case in point might be, I worked recently with, this is literally a 1-day project. I went into a high spec technology company and they make metal products for very high risk areas. So they make things for nuclear submarines, for the space station. So very, very high tolerances are on certain stuff, very bespoke, very expensive things. So they wanted to implement a 100% quality to the customer process. Because if their components fail, people die. It's an admirable goal, 100% every time. And what they'd done is they'd looked at the machinations of how do we make that work. So they'd introduced more and more QA. They'd introduced more and more checks and x-rays of their metal products and so on. They'd introduced incentives for people to achieve 100%. So I went in to have a chat and they were still only running at about 96%. They had a huge amount of failure rate and they were having to create a second QA department at the end of the process to double check, manually check everything going out. So it was a very expensive process. So what we did is we went in and I had the introduction meeting in their boardroom. Beautiful oak desk covered with cables. No computers or anything, but they're ready so you can plug your laptops in. There's cables everywhere.
Right.
But before I got to there, I was sat in their reception, which had a dirty mug sat on the table next to me. There was a pile of magazines that were like 5 years out of date. It's like an old doctor's waiting room. And all of these little pieces of evidence showed that what you say you're about, 100% quality and precision, is not what we're really about. Because the managing director and his board walked me past that dirty cup into a room that was strewn with cables, etc. So what we did is the very quick piece of work is we can point out these what we call cultural artifacts. Right. These things that say that we're not quite walking our talk. And also you're measuring an output of quality. Mm-hmm. So you're incentivizing 100%. Why don't you incentivize failure? Incentivize spotting where there are cracks, where there are things not quite right. Incentivize that. You want to catch people doing things wrong, not just reward the output they're right. Those two changes cost them nothing. It didn't change the investment into their structure. They just changed the mechanics in the incentive structure. Mm-hmm. They moved the coffee cups and tidied their stuff up and made sure that it looked like they were saying. It cost for my services for 1 day to go around and point these things out. They've already made a £20,000 improvement in the first month, and it cost them nothing.
Absolutely. It's those small things that can go under the radar that actually have a huge impact. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned about the cup. One of the things that I've naturally got into over the years is when I'm observing businesses, one of the first places I go and have a look at is the kitchen.
Toilets. Oh, those are toilets.
You figure out like, okay, well, what are we doing? And if the kitchen is in a bit of a mess, shall we say, and like you were referring to there, a bit dated, it's not been taken care of, then straight away I'm thinking, yeah, people perhaps, they're not as focused on the quality piece, or, there's a disconnect going on. And yeah, I think that there's a lot of truth in that from what you're
It
sharing.
does depend on what you want to be famous for, and it does depend. Sometimes having a dirty bathroom, a dirty kitchen actually might not be a red flag. But if you're saying we're about family, community, collaboration, and team working, well, that's great. I'm not here to challenge your strategy and your direction, but what things do you have that support that? Because you currently have an individual sales mechanic. So actually, if a customer has a deal done and then they ring back to change the address, the second person might just cancel the first order and claim it for themselves. So that is incongruent with what you're doing. I had a client who had a flood and everybody came to help clean the offices out. The two directors didn't. So you're
Right.
unintentionally creating another ring. So it's how are you trained to spot these little pieces of evidence that what you say you're about and what it's really about might not be quite the same.
100%. And I find as well, Danny, I don't know if you get this too, that sometimes when you're sharing this information with business leaders, there's an aspect of underlying, is this person judging? And I always try and say that, that it's coming from a place of understanding, not necessarily judgment. That I've made suggestions in the past around like parking spaces for particular people. You're kind of building up that us and them division straight away by having designated parking spaces. And
Yeah.
that can be quite a contentious thing to say for some people. And I understand what's driving it. And it seems to me that there is that piece around people that, well, is that person judging me by putting that suggestion forward? But if you just flip it around as it's an understanding piece, not necessarily judgment, it helps massively to become a bit more open-minded about these areas that we're touching on today. Because a lot of it is, it's very human, it's sensitive. We're talking about things like emotions, and that can be a bit tricky for some business leaders to get their head into.
All businesses are people businesses. All
Yeah.
of them. Even if you work on your own, there's still a person in that business, and your customers are business, and your supply chain are business. So we often forget about the soft, squishy bits. And parking is a great example of, yes, it creates a status between, or the directors have got space and I don't. I've seen parking spaces be issued as incentive prizes or employee of the month prizes.
Right.
So it's temporary. And I've seen that work quite well, but it's still a sugar high. I've also seen completely egalitarian parking where it's first come, first served. And you think on the surface that makes sense. But actually, you've got people that can't leave 10 minutes early because they've got to do the school run. So you're unintentionally disenfranchising certain people from that benefit that you have on site. For me, it's all about intentionality. What is it you want to achieve? What are the behaviors that help it? What's encouraging those behaviors and what's getting in the way? And it can often be really small, simple things. How do we say thank you? What are the cups that we walk past? What's the state of the bathroom? It's not always we need to rip up the employee handbook and get somebody in to write it all from scratch, although that might also be one of those artifacts. But it's the little things that you say that this is what we're about. In the book, I write about a value of speed, a
Right.
company that had a value of speed because it was how can we resolve customers' queries as fast as possible and stun them? But then it became almost weaponized in the organization because it took 2 hours to get a password reset on your laptop. So it was, oh, I thought we operated with speed here. No, even the barrier gates, the access control breaks, they were on the blink one day. So you had 700 people trying to get through two gates. And it's,
Right.
I thought we operated with speed here. So what do you have that says that I live those values, that they're not just laminated on the wall and they are helping our business? Start with that, and then when you do, you walk around, you can go, well, that doesn't help with our value of customer obsession or trust or whatever it is you've chosen as your values. That's a great place to start.
Absolutely. So wrapping up then, if anybody needs to get in touch with you, I'll make sure that we include all the links below for the podcast that's available on YouTube. I'll push it out on our socials as well and links to that. But if anybody needs to get hold of you, having seen this and just wants to get in touch, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
So LinkedIn is probably the place I'm most active. I'm one of the few Danny Warehams. I'm certainly the one that comes up first on the searches. I'm not the software developer in Georgia. You can also find me at dannywareham.com or at firgun.co.uk, Firgun. Yeah, and I'm pretty easy to find.
Excellent. Yeah. What would you say is your favorite recognition moment that costs nothing? And whilst you're thinking about that, I'll just put a bit of info out there for us. So if you do need to sort of follow up on anything we spoke about today, you can get our HR health check available through the website. The link will be below. You can follow us on LinkedIn. Again, Richard Tunnicliffe, search for that. There is a few Richard Tunnicliffes, but if you pop in the HR doctor as well, that'll give you the information that you need. And Luke, it's been absolutely fantastic speaking to you today, Danny. And just coming back to that point, what's your favourite recognition moment that costs nothing? Any thoughts on?
Yeah, I have several. There are some that were costing anyway, and we did them differently. But I personally like the onboarding with the coffee. A lot of people talk about sales funnels as being you cast your net, you whittle down, you do the deal, you get the person over the line, and then you ignore them until the sale is delivered, until the sofa is delivered or whatever. But actually, that's the point where you get buyer's remorse. That's the most emotive point of a sale. In onboarding employees, it's exactly the same. You've cast your net wide, you've put your job out there on Indeed or whatever, you've whittled it down, they've gone through their interviews, etc. They've got the job. You start next week, and then they have radio silence until they join. That's the buyer's remorse. That's when they're going, oh, I've just landed the job at ABC Metals, and that's where their mates can go, oh, I had a mate that worked there, and they say it's terrible. So actually, how do you make that less emotive? How do you make that you've made the right decisions and we're really lucky that you chose to work here? So anything you can do at that point to set the expectations of what is the onboarding process. So who will meet you? What time? You won't have your laptop on the first day, but don't worry because we're going to do X, Y, and Z on the first day. And Sarah's going to meet you in the lobby with your vanilla latte that you never expected. Now, none of that costs any money, but it sets a lot of certainty and it says that you matter. And that's ultimately what recognition is.
Yeah, making people feel seen 100%. I mean, one of the things that I found incredibly useful to inform these kind of things, and it kind of stems from, okay, well, what recognition is available and it's for free. I had a situation a few years ago that always sticks in my mind. I always find it curious how having informal conversations actually can have a big impact on what sticks with you. When people talk about influence, a lot of the time, influence can come from very informal discussions with people that at the time when it's something said, you don't really think much of it. But actually, when you refer back to it, people could refer back to that for years and years to come. So the influence is incredibly powerful. And one that sticks out in my mind was an exit interview that I was doing with an employee that essentially they were leaving because they were changing career path, but they'd actually been involved with this business from memory, it was over a decade. And one of the bits of feedback that was given in the exit interview was around a piece of praise that the line manager had given to this person years prior that had actually been one of the main drivers behind that person staying for as long as they did. And they said that this was something that if they were having a bad day, and it was something like, if we had 1 million people like you, this would be amazing. That was kind of the context of the feedback. And that's what made them stay. It was something that in passing, it was probably a 10-second remark that stuck with that person for a hell of a long time.
You can be a succulent carrot in that soup, or you can be a cockroach. What are you? How are you improving the culture? How do you make the other vegetable in the fruit feel? Leaders cast huge shadows. So how are you using your presence to make people feel a certain way?
Yeah,
great example, Rich.